Hey there, guys. Today we're going to start our chapter on fossils. This will be chapter 10, and we're going to start things off with section 1, talking about the different ways that fossils form and the ways that we categorize them. Hopefully, by the end of the video, you can pick these different types of fossils out just by looking at them. So, let's get started.
All right, well, first of all, just a quick definition of fossils. They are the preserved remains or preserved traces of living things. Most of them form in rock, although not all of them. You can have fossils that are found in substances like tar or ice. But to begin with here, we're going to focus on the fossils that form in rock. Those fossils can form in three different ways. We have molds and casts, we have petrified fossils, and we have carbon films. And then the other thing you can find in rock, which is not actually the preserved remains of an organism, is something called trace fossils, which are the preserved remains of things like footprints, nests, and things like that that indicate a prehistoric organism was present there, but it's not the actual remains of the organism. Our first ones that we'll deal with will be molds and casts. These are the most common type of fossils that you're going to find. And what happens with mold and cast is, first of all, an organism gets buried and then it rots away. And once it's gone, it leaves a hollow space in the sediment in a perfect shape of what the organism used to be. That's a cast. Now a mold forms when water is able to flow into that hollow space and over time deposit minerals in that space. And in the end you get a chunk of minerals that look just like the original plant or animal, and that's a mold. Molds and casts preserve the details of the organism's structure very well.
Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Here is a mold. The mold is the hollow space in the perfect shape of an organism that's left behind after a buried organism rots away. A cast, on the other hand, is a solid copy of the shape of the organism. It's made out of the minerals that are left as water flows through the mold and deposits those minerals over time. So we have casts and we have molds.
All right, next up we have petrified fossils. The word petrified literally means turned to stone. And what happens with petrified fossils is organisms end up buried in sediment, and mineral-rich water actually seeps into the cells of the organism, and then the minerals harden. When you look at a petrified fossil, you're actually looking at some of the original animal or the original plant. They've just been preserved by the hardened minerals inside the cells. A great example of a petrified fossil is petrified wood, and there's an example of it here. Finally, we have carbon films. An interesting thing happens when an organism is subjected to a lot of heat and pressure after being buried. Sometimes all of the elements that make up the organism escape as gas, except for the carbon that's in the plant or animal. And those carbon atoms that get left behind, they form a thin layer or a film in the sediment. Carbon films actually preserve a tremendous amount of detail, and they give us a lot of information about prehistoric plants, prehistoric insects, things like that. Here's an example of a carbon film of a prehistoric plant, and again you can see the detail is pretty impressive. No other type of fossil gives us that kind of detail. Next we want to talk about trace fossils. Trace fossils are not actually evidence, or I'm sorry, they're not actually fossils of the organism itself. Instead, they are fossilized pieces of evidence that show us what was going on in an area and what sorts of organisms were there. They include fossilized footprints. Trace fossils provide lots of information about an organism, including did it live alone or in groups, obviously where did it live, what kind of shape did it have, and even how it got its food. Here's an example of a trace fossil. These are fossilized footprints. Finally, we want to talk about preserved remains. These are fossils that are not formed in rock. I mentioned at the beginning that organisms can be trapped in tar. Tar seeps into the pores of the bone and preserves the skeleton. Organisms can be trapped in amber. Amber is sticky tree sap that traps insects and then seals them in an airtight environment that protects them from decay. And then also organisms can be trapped in ice. Mammoths have been found in Alaska and Siberia, and freezing has even preserved their skin and hair. Here's an example of some preserved remains in amber. Amber forms from tree sap, so these insects were trapped in amber, and they are perfectly preserved there, not really fossilized. Here is a woolly mammoth that was discovered in Siberia, and it just froze. It was taken out of the ice, and you can see the skin and the hair all there, preserved. They did not rot away. So kind of a cool thing there. Let's talk about what we learn from fossils. First of all, the fossil record provides information about the history of life on this planet and past environments. Fossils can tell us whether an area was underwater. If you find fossils of fish and other organisms that live underwater, they can tell us whether the area was cold or dry. Fossils also show climate change. We find certain organisms that only live in certain climates in places that aren't the same anymore. We talked about this when we talked about continental drift and seafloor spreading. The fact that we find fossils of ferns in Antarctica indicates that the climate in Antarctica has changed from being a climate where tropical plants could grow to now just being a place that is covered with ice. Changes in organisms, we see that in the fossil record. The fossil record shows us that life on Earth has changed over time. We don't have the same kind of organisms running around here today that were running around millions of years ago. When you look at older rocks, they contain fossils of very simple organisms, while the younger rocks contain fossils of more complex organisms. So we see that over time, life on the planet has become more complex and better developed.
At this time, I'd like for you guys to discuss these following questions with your group. And if you want, you can have somebody jot down your answers, but either way, be prepared to share what you guys think are the answers with the rest of the class here in just a little bit. First of all, what is a fossil? Second, just generally describe how most fossils form. Third, which parts of an organism are likely to be preserved, or most likely to be preserved, and why? Fourth, how are petrified fossils similar to preserved remains, and also how are they different? And then finally, what does the fossil record show about how life has changed over time?